Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The neighbor next door. The summer before everything changed was supposed to be perfect. I had just turned 16 that June, and life stretched out before me like an endless highway of possibilities. My biggest concerns revolved around whether I'd make varsity soccer in the fall, if Sarah Mitchell would finally notice me when school started again, and whether I could convince my parents to extend my curfew past 11 o'clock on weekends. Looking back now, I realize how blissfully naive I was, how unprepared for the darkness that would soon creep into our quiet suburban neighborhood and shatter every illusion of safety I'd ever held. Our house sat nestled in one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods you see in movies, where the lawns are perpetually green, the sidewalks are always clean, and everyone waves to each other while walking their golden retrievers at sunset. Maple Street had been my entire world for 16 years, every crack in the pavement memorized from countless skateboard rides, every tree climbed at least once during my adventurous childhood. The Henderson house next door had been empty for 3 months after old Mrs. Henderson moved to Florida to live with her daughter, and honestly, we'd gotten used to the quiet. That particular evening in early August remains crystallized in my memory with an almost painful clarity. The air hung thick with humidity, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and turns every movement into an effort. I was sprawled across my bed, my laptop balanced precariously on my stomach as I scrolled through social media, occasionally glancing at my summer reading list with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Mom's voice drifted up from the kitchen, accompanied by the familiar symphony of pots and pans that meant she was preparing her legendary fettuccine alfredo, a Friday night tradition in our household that had survived since I was old enough to eat solid food. The garlic and butter scent wafted through my open door, making my stomach growl with anticipation. Dad had texted earlier that he was stopping by the video store on his way home from work, probably grabbing some action movie that Mom would pretend to hate but secretly enjoy. My younger sister Emma was at her friend's house for a sleepover, which meant I wouldn't have to deal with her constant attempts to hang out in my room and touch all my stuff. Everything felt normal, routine, safe in that boring way that teenagers complain about but secretly find comforting. The first sign that our peaceful existence was about to be disrupted came in the form of a massive moving truck that rumbled down our street just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. I heard it before I saw it, the deep diesel engine breaking the suburban quiet like thunder on a clear day. Curiosity pulled me to my window, where I watched the truck reverse into the Henderson driveway with surprising precision. Moving trucks weren't unusual in our neighborhood, but something about this one made me pause and continue watching instead of returning to my mindless scrolling. A single man emerged from the truck's cab, and even from my second-story window, I could tell he was different from our typical Maple Street residents. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, with closely cropped gray hair that suggested military precision and a bearing that spoke of authority and discipline. He wore a simple white t-shirt that stretched across broad shoulders and dark jeans that looked pressed with military creases. There was something about the way he moved, economical and purposeful, that reminded me of the police officers who sometimes visited our school for safety presentations. As if sensing my observation, the man suddenly looked up directly at my window. Our eyes met across the distance, and I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine despite the evening's warmth. He didn't wave or smile like a normal new neighbor might. Instead, he held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds before nodding slowly and returning to his task of unloading boxes from the truck. I stepped back from the window, my heart beating slightly faster than normal, though I couldn't explain why. Over the next few hours, I found myself repeatedly drawn back to the window, watching as our new neighbor single-handedly unloaded the entire truck. No moving company, no friends helping, just him methodically carrying box after box into the house. Mom called me down for dinner around 7, and I mentioned the new neighbor as we tucked into her amazing pasta. Dad seemed pleased to hear we'd have someone living next door again, especially when I mentioned the man's military bearing. Probably a veteran, Dad said with approval, twirling his fork expertly. Good to have someone reliable next door, someone who knows about security and keeping watch. If only we had known how prophetic and yet completely wrong those words would prove to be. The next morning arrived with a blazing sun that promised another scorching August day. I was shooting baskets in our driveway, working on my free throws while the temperature was still bearable, when I heard a door close nearby. Our new neighbor stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching me with an intensity that made me miss my next shot entirely. The ball bounced off the rim and rolled toward his lawn, coming to rest against his freshly trimmed hedge. "Morning, young man," he called out, his voice carrying a gravelly authority that confirmed my suspicions about a military background. "You've got good form on that shot." I jogged over to retrieve my ball, offering a polite smile that my mother had drilled into me since childhood. "Thanks, I'm trying to make varsity this year, so I've been practicing every morning." He descended his porch steps with measured movements, extending his hand when he reached me. "Name's Frank Morrison, just retired from the force after 30 years of service. Thought this quiet neighborhood would be perfect for my retirement years." His handshake was firm, perhaps a bit too firm, and lasted a beat longer than felt comfortable. Up close, I could see the lines etched deep around his eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting into harsh realities most people never have to face. His eyes themselves were pale blue, almost grey, and they never seemed to blink as often as normal people's did. "I'm Alex," I replied, gently extracting my hand from his grip. "Welcome to Maple Street, Mr. Morrison. My parents will probably stop by later to introduce themselves properly. Mom usually bakes something for new neighbors." His face transformed with what I supposed was meant to be a smile, though it didn't quite reach those unsettling eyes. "That's very neighborly of her, very neighborly indeed. And please, call me Frank. Mr. Morrison makes me feel ancient, though I suppose to someone your age, I already am." He laughed at his own joke, a sound that seemed forced and rehearsed, like he was playing a role he'd studied but didn't quite understand. I laughed politely in response, already backing away toward my driveway. Something about his presence made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't define or justify. Maybe it was the way his gaze seemed to catalogue every detail about me, or how he stood just a little too close, invading that invisible bubble of personal space we all maintain. "Well, I should get back to practicing," I said, bouncing the ball once for emphasis. "Nice meeting you, Mr. Morrison. I mean Frank." "Oh, don't let me interrupt your training," he said, but instead of leaving, he stood there watching as I dribbled back to my makeshift court. "You know, I used to coach basketball at the youth center near my old precinct. If you ever want some pointers, I'd be happy to help." I mumbled something non-committal and resumed shooting, hyper-aware of his presence lingering on his lawn. He watched me take another dozen shots before finally returning to his house, and even then, I caught glimpses of him through his living room window, still observing. My practice session ended earlier than usual that day, driven inside by a discomfort I couldn't shake. Over the following weeks, Frank Morrison integrated himself into our neighborhood's rhythm with unsettling efficiency. He attended every block party, joined the neighborhood watch with enthusiasm that bordered on zealousness, and somehow managed to appear wherever I happened to be with a frequency that defied coincidence. If I was mowing our lawn, he'd materialize with tips about optimal cutting patterns. When I walked to the corner store, he'd coincidentally need something from the same place. If friends came over to shoot hoops, he'd emerge to water plants that never seemed to actually need watering. My parents, initially charmed by his attention and apparent concern for neighborhood safety, began to notice the pattern too. Mom mentioned it casually one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. her voice carefully neutral in that way that meant she was more concerned than she let on. "Frank certainly seems to have taken a shine to you, honey. He asks about you every time I see him." "It's weird, Mom," I admitted, grateful for the opening to voice my concerns. "He's always around, always watching, and he asks really personal questions like what classes I'm taking, who my friends are, what time I usually get home from school." Dad's newspaper lowered slightly, his expression thoughtful. "He's probably just lonely, adjusting to retirement and a new neighborhood, but I'll have a word with him if it's making you uncomfortable." But before Dad could have that conversation, things escalated in a way that transformed vague discomfort into genuine fear. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August, one of those oppressively hot days where the air shimmers with heat waves and even the birds seem too exhausted to sing. I was home alone, my parents at work and Emma at day camp, enjoying the solitude and air conditioning while binge-watching a show on my laptop. The doorbell rang, interrupting a particularly intense scene, and I padded downstairs in my socks, expecting a package delivery. Frank Morrison stood on our porch, his smile wider than usual, holding what appeared to be a plate of cookies covered in plastic wrap. "Afternoon, Alex. I thought you might enjoy some homemade chocolate chip cookies. Just pulled them from the oven." The sweet smell wafting from the plate was indeed tempting, but every instinct screamed at me not to open the door fully. I kept the chain lock engaged, speaking through the narrow gap. "That's really nice of you, Frank, but my parents don't like me accepting food when they're not home. You know, allergies and stuff." His smile flickered momentarily, a flash of something darker crossing his features before the friendly mask snapped back into place. Of course, safety first, very wise. But surely you could just take them and save them for later when your parents can check them?" "I really can't," I insisted, my hand tightening on the door handle. "But thank you anyway. Maybe you could bring them by when my parents get home around 6? He stood there for a long moment, his pale eyes boring into mine through the gap, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope, being studied and categorized. Finally, he stepped back, his smile now completely absent. 6 o'clock then," he said, his tone flat and cold. "I'll be sure to come by when Mommy and Daddy are home to protect you." The condescension in his voice made my cheeks burn, but I maintained eye contact until he turned and walked back to his house. I watched through the peephole as he stopped halfway across his lawn, turned back to stare at our house for a full minute, then continued inside. My hands were shaking as I engaged the deadbolt and texted both my parents about the encounter. That evening, Frank did indeed return with cookies, all charm and neighborly concern when my parents were present. Dad accepted them graciously while Mom engaged Frank in small talk, but I caught the meaningful looks they exchanged when Frank's attention was elsewhere. After he left, Dad discreetly disposed of the cookies, and Mom suggested I start keeping my phone on me at all times, just as a precaution. The next few days passed without incident, though I noticed Frank's car following me more than once when I rode my bike to friends' houses. He never did anything overtly threatening, always maintaining just enough distance to claim coincidence if confronted, but his presence was constant and oppressive, like a storm cloud that follows you wherever you go. The breaking point came on a Friday night, exactly 2 weeks after Frank Morrison moved in next door. My parents had gone to a restaurant for their anniversary, trusting me to hold down the fort for a few hours. Emma was at another sleepover, her social calendar far more active than mine. I had plans to order pizza and game online with friends, a perfect low-key evening that required nothing more than Wi-Fi and a lack of parental supervision. Around 9 o'clock, as darkness settled over Maple Street like a thick blanket, I noticed movement in our backyard through the kitchen window. My first thought was that it might be a raccoon or the neighbor's cat that sometimes hunted in our garden. I flicked on the back porch light and peered out into the illuminated yard, my blood turning to ice when I saw Frank Morrison standing near our back fence, perfectly still, staring directly at me through the window. He didn't run or try to hide when the light exposed him. Instead, He raised his hand in a slow wave, that unsettling smile spreading across his face. He was holding something in his other hand, something small and dark that I couldn't quite make out. My mind raced through options as my thumb frantically unlocked my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, he placed whatever he was holding on our patio table and walked calmly back toward the fence line. I stood frozen at the window, watching as he climbed over our fence with surprising agility for a man his age and disappeared into his own yard. My heart hammered against my ribs as I called my parents, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. Dad's voice went from confused to furious in seconds, telling me to lock all doors and windows and not answer for anyone except them or the police. While waiting for my parents to race home, I watched the back patio through the window, that mysterious object sitting on our table like a malevolent presence. When Mom and Dad arrived 15 minutes later, accompanied by 2 police officers they'd called on the way, Dad carefully retrieved the item while the officers stood guard. It was a photograph, slightly blurry but unmistakably me, taken through my bedroom window as I slept. The angle suggested it had been taken from outside, possibly from a ladder or from the large oak tree that grew near my window. Written on the back in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "You look so peaceful when you sleep." The police took the photograph as evidence and went to question Frank Morrison, but his house was dark and his car was gone. They promised to return first thing in the morning, suggesting we might want to stay in a hotel for the night. But Dad, his jaw set with determination, refused to be driven from our own home. Instead, he called his brother, Uncle Mike, who arrived within an hour with his hunting rifle, and they set up a watch rotation for the night. I didn't sleep at all, sitting in my parents' room with Mom while Dad and Uncle Mike took turns patrolling the house. Every shadow seemed threatening, every normal house sound potentially sinister. Around 3 in the morning, Uncle Mike spotted Frank's car returning to his driveway, and the police were immediately called back. What happened next unfolded like something from a crime drama I might have watched on a lazy afternoon, except this was terrifyingly real and happening just yards from where I huddled with my mother. Police officers surrounded Frank's house, their voices carrying through the still night air as they demanded he come out with his hands visible. For 10 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as they were preparing to enter forcefully, Frank emerged, fully dressed despite the hour, his hands raised but his face calm and almost amused. We watched from our darkened windows as they arrested him, the red and blue lights painting our familiar neighborhood in surreal colors. As they led him to the squad car, Frank turned toward our house, somehow knowing exactly which window I was watching from, and smiled that terrible smile one last time. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "This isn't over." The next morning brought a parade of investigators, crime scene technicians, and journalists who had somehow already caught wind of the story. We learned that Frank Morrison was indeed a former police officer, but he'd been forced into early retirement after multiple complaints of inappropriate behavior and stalking. The investigators found dozens of photographs of me in his house, some taken from distances that suggested he'd been following me for weeks, possibly even before officially moving to our neighborhood. But then came the revelation that changed everything, the piece of information that transformed a straightforward stalking case into something far more complex and horrifying. In Frank's basement, investigators found a wall covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a years-long investigation into child abduction cases. At the center of it all was a photograph that made my mother gasp and my father's face drain of color. It was me, but younger, maybe 3 or 4 years old, standing between 2 adults whose faces had been circled in red marker. Below the photograph, in Frank's meticulous handwriting, was a single question. Where are they now? The male detective, a kind-faced man named Detective Rodriguez, sat with us in our living room as he explained what they'd found. Frank Morrison had been investigating a cold case from his time on the force, a case involving a child who had disappeared from a shopping center 14 years ago. The child had never been found, but Frank had never given up, even after his retirement. His investigation had led him to our neighborhood, to our house, to me. "We're going to need to run some tests," Detective Rodriguez said gently, his eyes full of a sympathy that made my stomach drop. "DNA tests, specifically, to rule out what Mr. Morrison seems to believe." I looked at my parents, expecting them to laugh, to express outrage at such a ridiculous suggestion. Instead, I saw something in their faces I'd never seen before, fear mixed with a terrible uncertainty. Mom's hand found mine, squeezing so tight it almost hurt, while Dad stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "That's absurd," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Alex is our son. He's always been our son. We have his birth certificate, hospital records, everything." Detective Rodriguez nodded patiently. "I'm sure you do, ma'am, and I'm sure this will all be cleared up quickly. But given Mr. Morrison's history with the force and the evidence he's compiled, we need to follow through with due diligence." The next few days passed in a surreal haze. DNA tests were taken, questions were asked about my early childhood, and I noticed my parents watching me with expressions I couldn't read. They assured me repeatedly that everything would be fine, that Frank Morrison was delusional, that our family was exactly what it had always been. But late at night, I heard them talking in hushed, urgent voices, and once I caught Mom crying quietly in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. The test results came back on a Thursday morning that had started like any other. Detective Rodriguez returned, this time accompanied by several other officials, including someone from social services. I knew before anyone spoke that our lives were about to shatter completely. The look on Detective Rodriguez's face said everything. The DNA results were conclusive. The people I'd called Mom and Dad for 16 years were not my biological parents. The couple in Frank Morrison's photograph, the ones with their faces circled in red, were my real parents, and they'd been searching for me for 14 years. The room erupted in chaos. Mom collapsed into Dad's arms, sobbing uncontrollably while insisting there had to be a mistake. Dad's face cycled through denial, anger, and finally a devastating resignation. I sat frozen on the couch, my mind unable to process what was happening. The parents I'd loved my entire life were strangers. The creepy neighbor I'd feared was the only one who'd seen the truth. What followed was a careful, painful explanation. My parents, the people who'd raised me, swore they hadn't known. They'd adopted me through what they believed was a legitimate private adoption agency when I was 3 years old. They had paperwork, documentation, everything that seemed legal and proper. But the agency, it turned out, had been a front for something much darker, run by people who specialized in kidnapping children and creating new identities for them. My biological parents were contacted immediately. They lived just 2 states away, had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. The photographs Frank Morrison had found were from age progression software they'd commissioned every year, imagining what their lost son might look like. The most recent one, Detective Rodriguez showed me, was startlingly accurate. The reunion was arranged for the following week, giving everyone time to process and prepare. A therapist was assigned to help navigate the impossible situation. The people I'd called Mom and Dad were cleared of criminal wrongdoing, but were devastated by the revelation that their beloved son had been stolen from another family. They loved me genuinely, had raised me well, but none of that changed the fundamental horror of the situation. Frank Morrison, meanwhile, was released from custody with all stalking charges dropped. He was proclaimed a hero by some media outlets, the determined detective who never gave up on a cold case. But I couldn't shake the memory of him standing in our backyard, taking pictures of me sleeping, following me around the neighborhood. His methods had been invasive and terrifying, even if his intentions had ultimately been to reunite me with my biological family. The meeting with my biological parents was held in a neutral location, a comfortable room at the police station designed for such sensitive situations. They looked older than their years, worn down by 14 years of grief and searching. My biological mother's hands shook as she reached for me, then pulled back, unsure if she had the right to touch the son who was a stranger to her. My biological father stood slightly behind her, tears streaming down his face as he studied my features, finding echoes of himself and his wife in my face. They showed me photographs of my early childhood, the few precious years before I was taken. A baby in a crib, a toddler taking first steps, a small boy laughing on a swing. They told me my real name, the one they'd given me at birth, though it sounded foreign and wrong on my tongue. They talked about the day I disappeared, how my biological mother had turned away for just a moment in a crowded shopping center, and when she turned back, I was gone. The aftermath stretched on for months. Legal proceedings, custody evaluations, therapy sessions that seemed to lead nowhere. The parents who raised me fought to maintain some role in my life, while my biological parents had legal and moral claims I couldn't dispute. I was caught between two families, two lives, two versions of myself that couldn't be reconciled. I chose to finish high school while living with the parents who'd raised me, with regular visits to my biological parents. It was an impossible situation that satisfied no one but seemed like the least damaging option. The neighborhood watched our drama unfold with a mixture of sympathy and morbid fascination. Some people brought casseroles and offered support. Others whispered behind their hands and kept their children away from our house, as if tragedy might be contagious. Frank Morrison moved away 3 months after everything came to light. I saw him packing his car one morning, and our eyes met across the lawn that had once separated our houses. He nodded, that same slow nod from the first day we'd met, and I found myself nodding back. He'd torn my life apart, but he'd also revealed a truth that deserved to be known, no matter how painful. I still don't know how to feel about him. The parents who raised me, I still call them Mom and Dad because I don't know what else to call them, never fully recovered from the revelation. Their marriage survived, but it was changed, marked by a grief that couldn't be properly mourned because the son they'd lost had never really been theirs to lose. They loved me, that was never in question, but every interaction was now colored by the knowledge of how I'd come to them. My biological parents tried so hard to reclaim the son they'd lost, but 14 years is a lifetime in childhood. I didn't remember them, didn't remember the life they described, didn't feel the connection they desperately wanted to resurrect. They were strangers with familiar features, people whose DNA I shared, but whose lives felt completely foreign to me. The investigation into the adoption agency revealed a network of kidnapped children placed with unsuspecting families across the country. Dozens of families were torn apart as the truth came to light. Children returned to biological parents they didn't remember. Adoptive parents devastated to learn their beloved children had been stolen. It was a tragedy that rippled outward, touching lives in ways that couldn't be measured or contained. I'm in my 20s now, still navigating the aftermath of that summer when Frank Morrison moved in next door. I have relationships with both sets of parents, complicated and imperfect but real. Therapy helped, though some wounds never fully heal. I went to college in a different state, partly to escape the weight of everyone knowing my story, partly to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by this impossible situation. Sometimes I dream about that summer before everything changed, when my biggest worry was making varsity soccer and whether Sarah Mitchell would notice me. I dream about the family dinners with Mom's fettuccine alfredo, Dad bringing home movies from the video store, Emma annoying me by hanging around my room. It was a life built on a lie, but it was the only life I'd known, and there are days when I miss its simplicity with an ache that takes my breath away. I've never forgotten Frank Morrison's face, those pale eyes that saw too much, that terrible smile that haunted my dreams for years. He was right about everything, but being right doesn't make someone good, doesn't excuse the fear he instilled or the methods he used. He was a man obsessed with justice who forgot about mercy, determined to solve a puzzle, without considering that the pieces were human beings with feelings and lives that would be shattered by his revelation. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it imprisons you in a reality you never asked for, with questions that have no good answers. Who am I really? The son of the people who raised me with love, even if they obtained me through deception? Or the son of strangers who never stopped searching, whose lives were destroyed by my disappearance? The answer is both and neither. A paradox I'll spend my lifetime trying to resolve. But there's one thing I know for certain. That summer taught me that the world is far more complex and dangerous than most 16-year-olds ever realize. It taught me that monsters don't always look like monsters, that sometimes they look like concerned neighbors with good intentions and terrible methods. It taught me that love isn't always enough to make a family legitimate, but it's also the only thing that makes any family real. Frank Morrison was both the villain and the hero of my story, the creepy neighbor who stalked me and the determined detective who revealed the truth about my past. The parents who raised me were both victims and inadvertent perpetrators, loving me genuinely while unknowingly perpetuating a terrible crime. My biological parents were both strangers and family, connected to me by blood but separated by years of absence. These contradictions don't resolve neatly. Life isn't a story with clear heroes and villains, with satisfying endings that tie up all loose threads. It's messy and complicated and sometimes cruel, but it's also filled with love that persists despite impossible circumstances, with people who do their best even when their best isn't enough, with truth that hurts but still needs to be known. That summer ended my childhood, not just because of what I learned about my past, but because of what I learned about the world. Safety is an illusion, family is complicated, and sometimes the people who seem most dangerous are the ones trying to help, while the people who seem most loving are unknowingly part of a terrible deception. These are hard lessons for anyone to learn, especially a 16-year-old who just wanted to make the basketball team and get a girl to notice him. I still live with these truths every day. When I meet new people, I wonder what secrets they're hiding, what truths lurk beneath their normal facades. When I see happy families, I wonder if their happiness is built on solid ground or on lies they don't yet know about. It's exhausting, this constant questioning, but it's also part of who I am now, shaped by that summer when everything I thought I knew turned out to be wrong. The story made national news, of course. Stolen child reunited with family after 14 years thanks to persistent detective. The headlines made it sound like a triumph, a happy ending to a tragic story. But headlines can't capture the complexity of 5 people's lives being torn apart and imperfectly reassembled. They can't convey the grief of parents losing a child they'd raised as their own, or the confusion of a teenager discovering his entire life was built on someone else's crime. Frank Morrison was interviewed extensively, praised for his dedication and investigative skills. He never mentioned the stalking, the photographs, the fear he'd instilled. In his version of events, he was simply a concerned neighbor who noticed something amiss and followed his instincts. Maybe that's how he saw it. Maybe in his mind, the ends justified the means. But I remember the terror of seeing him in our backyard, the violation of knowing he'd been watching me sleep, the constant feeling of being hunted. Yet without him, I might never have known the truth. My biological parents might have died never knowing what happened to their son. The crime that stole me from them might have remained forever hidden. This is the paradox I live with. Gratitude mixed with resentment, truth tangled with trauma, revelation inseparable from violation. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I think about parallel universes, alternative timelines where different choices led to different outcomes. A universe where Frank Morrison never moved next door, where I grew up never knowing I was stolen. A universe where I was never taken from that shopping center, where I grew up with my biological parents. A universe where the truth came out differently, less traumatically, through some official investigation rather than a creepy neighbor's obsession. But this is the universe I inhabit, where truth came dressed as threat, where love and loss are so intertwined they can't be separated, where a 16-year-old boy learned that everything he believed about himself was both true and false simultaneously, where families were both destroyed and revealed, where a stalker was also a savior, where home became a concept too complex to ever fully understand again. The neighborhood has changed since then. New families have moved in, people who don't know the story or only know it as local legend. The Henderson house, where Frank Morrison briefly lived, has had 3 different owners since he left. My parents, the ones who raised me, still live in the same house, though they've talked about moving somewhere fresh, somewhere without memories that cut like glass. I visit them regularly, and we maintain a relationship that's loving but forever altered. We can't pretend that nothing happened, but we also can't let what happened destroy what we had. Emma, my sister who isn't technically my sister, took it hard at first but has come to accept our complicated reality. She still calls me her brother because that's what I'll always be to her. Dinner be damned. My biological parents have created a room for me in their house, decorated with all the photos from my early childhood, a shrine to the son they lost and partially found again. I stay there sometimes, trying to bridge the gap between who they remember and who I became. They're good people who deserved better than what happened to them. We all did. The adoption agency criminals were eventually caught and prosecuted, though the masterminds behind the operation received frustratingly light sentences considering the magnitude of their crimes. Some of the other stolen children were reunited with their biological families, while others, especially those who were older when the truth came out, chose to stay with the only families they'd ever known. There's no right answer to an impossible situation. As for me, I've built a life that acknowledges all parts of my story without being defined solely by any of them. I have a career, friends, even a cautious relationship with someone who accepts the complexity of my past. But I'm different from people who grew up with straightforward histories. I question more, trust less easily, look for hidden truths even when there probably aren't any. Every August, when the summer heat reaches that particular intensity that takes me back to that time, I remember the boy I was before Frank Morrison moved in next door. Innocent, secure in his identity, blissfully unaware of the lies underlying his existence. I mourn for that boy sometimes, even though his life was built on a foundation of crime and deception. His ignorance was a kind of blessing, his simple problems a luxury I'll never have again. But I also remember that the truth, however it comes, however much it hurts, is ultimately better than living a lie. My biological parents deserved to know what happened to their son. The criminals who stole children deserved to be caught. The adoptive parents who'd been deceived deserved to know the truth about their children's origins. And I deserved to know who I really was, even if that knowledge came at a terrible price. Frank Morrison sent me a letter once, about a year after everything happened. It was brief, formal, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of the pain his methods had caused. He wrote that he'd been driven by the memory of my biological mother's face when she'd reported me missing all those years ago, that he couldn't let go of the case even after retirement. He said he hoped I could eventually find peace with the truth he'd uncovered. I never replied to the letter, but I kept it. It sits in a box with other artifacts from that time. Newspaper clippings, legal documents, photos from both childhoods, the real and the false. Someday I might be ready to respond, to tell Frank Morrison that I understand his motivations even as I can't forgive his methods. That he gave me a truth I needed but didn't want, solved a mystery that created a dozen new ones, saved and destroyed me simultaneously. This is my story, though it belongs equally to all the people whose lives were changed that summer. We're all trying to make sense of it, to find meaning in the randomness and cruelty and unexpected revelations. We're all living with the aftermath of Frank Morrison's obsession and the crimes it uncovered. Some stories have clean endings, clear morals, satisfying resolutions. This isn't one of them. It's a story about the complexity of truth, the ambiguity of right and wrong, the impossibility of perfect justice in an imperfect world. It's about love that transcends legal definitions of family and trauma that can't be healed by simple reunions. It's about a 16-year-old boy who lost everything he thought he knew and had to rebuild himself from contradictory pieces. Most of all, it's a reminder that our neighbors, our families, ourselves, we're all mysteries to some degree. We all have secrets, whether we know them or not. And sometimes, the person watching from next door sees things we ourselves are blind to, truths we never suspected, realities we're not prepared to face. The summer Frank Morrison moved in next door was the summer my life exploded into fragments I'm still trying to piece together. It was the summer I learned that home is both more and less than I thought, that family is both blood and choice, that truth is both liberation and prison. It was the summer I stopped being who I thought I was and started becoming whoever I'm still figuring out how to be. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Take the pieces we take, the pieces we're given, the truths we uncover, the lies we've lived, and try to build something real from them. We move forward because that's the only direction available, carrying our contradictions and complications, our multiple selves and divided loyalties, our love for people on different sides of an impossible situation. That summer taught me that monsters and heroes can be the same person, that love and deception can coexist, that the truth you need and the truth you want are rarely the same thing. It taught me that some mysteries are better left unsolved, but also that some truths demand to be known regardless of the cost. It taught me that family is both more and less than DNA, that home is both a place and a feeling that can be lost in an instant and never fully recovered. I still walk past the Henderson house sometimes when I visit my parents, the ones who raised me. New children play in the yard now, their laughter carrying across the lawn where Frank Morrison once stood watching me. They don't know the history of that house, the role it played in unraveling lives and revealing truths. To them, it's just home, simple and uncomplicated, the way mine once was. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe every generation deserves its innocence, its time of feeling safe and knowing who they are, even if that knowledge is temporary or built on shifting sand. Maybe the complexity and pain and impossible choices can wait until they're older, until life forces them to confront the fact that nothing is as simple as it seems when you're young and secure in your place in the world. But for those of us who've had our illusions shattered, who've learned that the neighbor next door might see truths we're blind to, who've discovered that the life we're living might belong to someone else entirely, we carry a different kind of knowledge. We know that safety is temporary, that identity is fluid, that the people who love us might be unknowing participants in someone else's crime, and that the people who frighten us might be trying to save us in the only way they know how. This is the story I tell now, years later, still trying to make sense of that summer when everything changed. It's a story without heroes or villains, without clear answers or satisfying conclusions. It's a story about 5 people caught in an impossible situation, each trying to do what they thought was right, each causing pain in the pursuit of their own version of truth or love or justice. Frank Morrison disappeared into whatever life retired detectives build when their greatest case is solved but brings no peace. My biological parents continue to mourn the years they lost while trying to build something with the years they have left. The parents who raised me live with a grief that has no name, loving a son who was never legally theirs but will always be emotionally bound to them. And I continue forward, a living reminder that some stories don't end, they just become part of who we are, complicated and contradictory and impossibly real. The sound of that moving truck rumbling down Maple Street still echoes in my dreams sometimes, the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew. Frank Morrison's pale eyes still watch for my nightmares, seeing truths I couldn't imagine. The weight of that photograph, me sleeping peacefully while a stranger watched and documented, still makes my skin crawl with remembered violation. But alongside these dark memories are others. My mother's voice calling me down for dinner, the smell of garlic and butter from her fettuccine alfredo, my father's laugh at some ridiculous action movie, Emma pestering me to let her hang out in my room. These memories are tainted now by the knowledge of what lay beneath them, But they're also precious, evidence of love that was real even if its foundation was false. This is what I know now that I didn't know then. We're all living stories that could unravel at any moment. We're all one persistent neighbor, one DNA test, one revealed truth away from discovering that everything we believed about ourselves might be wrong. We're all potentially stolen children or unknowing kidnappers, victims and perpetrators, saved and damned by the same revelations. So when people ask me about that summer, about Frank Morrison and the truth he uncovered, I tell them this: be grateful for your simple truths, your uncomplicated families, your straightforward histories. But also be prepared for them to shatter, because sometimes the neighbor next door sees what you can't, knows what you don't, and brings truths that will destroy everything you thought you knew while simultaneously setting you free. The 16-year-old boy who worried about making varsity soccer and getting Sarah Mitchell's attention died that summer, replaced by someone more complex, more aware of the world's capacity for both cruelty and unexpected grace. I miss him sometimes, that innocent version of myself, but I couldn't go back to being him even if I could. Too much has been revealed. Too much has been lost and found and lost again. In the end, Frank Morrison was right about one thing he said in his letter. Eventually, you have to find peace with the truth, however it comes to you. Not because the truth is peaceful, but because fighting it is exhausting, and life demands that you move forward even when you don't know which direction forward is anymore. So I've made my peace, or at least my truce, with that summer and everything it revealed. I've accepted that I'll always be divided between two families, two histories, two versions of myself that can never fully reconcile. I've accepted that Frank Morrison will always be both my savior and my stalker, that my parents will always be both real and false, that my story will always be both triumph and tragedy. This is the story I live with, the truth I carry, the complexity I've learned to navigate. It started with a moving truck on a hot August evening and a man with pale eyes who saw too much. It continues every day as I try to build something genuine from the pieces of multiple lives, multiple truths, multiple selves that all have equal claim to being real. And somewhere out there, Frank Morrison probably watches another neighborhood, sees another truth that needs revealing, prepares to destroy and save someone else's life with his terrible gift for seeing what others miss. I hope he's learned to be gentler, to remember that the truths he uncovers belong to real people with real feelings and lives that will never be the same once his revelations come to light. But I also hope he never stops looking, because somewhere there are other stolen children living lives built on lies, other biological parents who deserve to know what happened to their babies, other adoptive parents who need to know the truth about how their beloved children came to them. The truth might be terrible, but it's also necessary, even when it comes in the form of a creepy neighbor who watches you through your bedroom window and leaves photographs on your patio table. This is my story, all of it, the beautiful and the terrible, the truth and the lies, the love that was real even when everything else was false. It's a story about the summer that changed everything, when the neighbor next door turned out to be both monster and hero, when the parents who raised me turned out to be both strangers and family, when I turned out to be both myself and someone else entirely. It's not the story I would have chosen, but it's the one I have, and I've learned to tell it without flinching from its contradictions and complications. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do with the truths that find us. Acknowledge them, accept them, and try to build something meaningful from the wreckage they leave behind. The boy shooting hoops in the driveway that morning when Frank Morrison first introduced himself had no idea what was coming. He couldn't have imagined that the firm handshake and pale eyes would lead to the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about himself. He couldn't have known that the discomfort he felt was his instinct trying to warn him that his life was about to explode into fragments that could never be fully reassembled. But maybe that's mercy, not knowing what's coming. Maybe we need our illusions for as long as we can keep them, our simple truths and straightforward lives, our belief that the people who raise us are our parents and the neighbors who watch us are just lonely retirees with too much time on their hands. Maybe the truth can wait until we're strong enough to bear it. Even though we're never really strong enough, we just learn to carry it anyway. So this is where the story ends, or at least where I stop telling it, though it continues every day in the choices I make and the relationships I navigate and the truth I've learned to live with. Frank Morrison moved in next door one August evening when I was 16 and thought I knew who I was. By the time he moved out, everything had changed, and I'm still figuring out what that means, who that makes me, how to be whole when you're made of pieces that don't quite fit together. But I'm trying, we're all trying, to make something real from the mess that truth sometimes makes of our lives. And maybe that's enough, the trying, the moving forward, the building something new from the ruins of what we thought we knew. Maybe that's all any of us can do when the neighbor next door sees too much and changes everything with what they reveal. The summer Frank Morrison moved in next door was the end of one life and the beginning of another, more complicated one. It was the summer I learned that home is wherever you make it, family is whoever loves you, and truth is both simpler and more complex than we ever imagine. It was the summer everything changed, and I'm still learning how to live with what it revealed. The woman in apartment 4B. The first time I noticed something was wrong with the woman in apartment 4B was on a Tuesday evening in September, though looking back now, the signs had been there from the moment she moved into our building 3 months earlier. My name is Marcus, and I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, working my first real job at a marketing firm downtown. The apartment complex on Cedar Avenue wasn't fancy, but it was clean, affordable, and most importantly, only a 15-minute commute from my office. I'd been living there for about a year when she arrived, bringing with her an atmosphere of wrongness that would eventually reveal truths about our entire building that none of us were prepared to face. She moved in during the middle of the night, which should have been my first red flag. I remember waking up around 3 in the morning to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway and the rhythmic thud of boxes being set down. Through my peephole, I caught glimpses of a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, moving boxes entirely by herself with a mechanical efficiency that seemed almost robotic. She was tall, unnaturally so, maybe 6'3" or 4", with long black hair that hung like a curtain down to her waist. Even in the dim hallway lighting, there was something unsettling about how she moved, too fluid, too precise, like someone who had practiced being human but hadn't quite mastered it. The next morning, I tried to be neighborly and knocked on her door with a plate of cookies my mother had sent me, the chocolate chip ones she made that could soften even the hardest hearts. The door opened just a crack, and I saw one dark eye peering at me through the gap. "Welcome to the building," I said, holding up the plate with what I hoped was a friendly smile. "I'm Marcus from 4A, right next door. Thought you might enjoy some homemade cookies while you're getting settled." The eye blinked once, twice, and then the door opened wider. She stood there in what looked like a vintage dress from the 1950s, complete with pearl necklace and perfectly styled hair, an outfit so formal and out of place for a casual Saturday morning that it made me take an involuntary step backward. Her face was beautiful in an unsettling way, too symmetrical, too perfect, like those AI-generated faces you see online that hit the uncanny valley just wrong enough to make your skin crawl. "How thoughtful," she said, and her voice had this weird quality to it, like multiple people speaking in unison but not quite synchronized. "I am Elizabeth. I appreciate your kindness. Marcus from 4A." The way she said my name and apartment number, like it was all one word, made me shiver despite the warm September morning. She took the cookies with hands that seemed too long, fingers that bent in places where there shouldn't be joints, and then closed the door without another word. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I just had an encounter with something pretending to be human rather than actually being one. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth's strangeness only intensified. She would leave her apartment at exactly the same time every day, 11:47 p.m., and return at exactly 5:23 a.m. I know this because I started keeping track, my curiosity overcoming my better judgment. She never carried a purse or bag, never wore a coat even when autumn brought freezing rain, and always wore those same vintage dresses that looked like they'd been pulled from a 1950s catalogue. Other tenants began noticing her too. Mrs. Chen from 3B mentioned that she'd seen Elizabeth standing in the hallway at 2 in the morning, just standing there, facing the wall, not moving for over an hour. Tommy, the college kid from 2A, swore he'd seen her on the roof during a thunderstorm, arms spread wide like she was trying to catch lightning. The building manager, Mr. Kowalski, just shrugged when we brought our concerns to him, saying she paid her rent on time and in cash, and that was all that mattered to him. But then the disappearances started. First, it was Sarah from 5C, a young nurse who worked irregular hours at the hospital. One day she was there, the next day she wasn't. Her apartment was cleaned out, no forwarding address, no goodbye to anyone. Mr. Kowalski said she'd broken her lease and left in the middle of the night, but Sarah and I had been friendly, and she'd never mentioned planning to move. A week later, the elderly couple from 3A vanished the same way. Then the family from 2B. Always the same story from Mr. Kowalski. They'd left suddenly, breaking their leases, no forwarding addresses. I started paying closer attention to Elizabeth after that. I installed a small camera in my peephole. Technically illegal, but I was past caring about technicalities. What I captured on that camera over the next few days changed everything I thought I knew about reality and sent me down a path that would reveal the horrifying truth about our entire apartment building. The footage showed Elizabeth leaving her apartment at her usual time, but sometimes she wouldn't walk down the hallway. Instead, she would stand outside different apartments, pressing her ear against the doors, sometimes for hours at a time. Her neck would extend in ways that necks shouldn't be able to extend, stretching like taffy until her ear was perfectly positioned at the keyhole. Other times, I caught her on camera doing something even more disturbing. She would open her mouth, wider and wider, until it was an impossible black void, and thin, writhing tendrils would emerge, sliding under the doors of apartments whose tenants would disappear within days. I knew I should leave, pack everything and run, but something kept me there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe it was the foolish belief that I could somehow stop whatever was happening, or maybe it was something else, something Elizabeth was doing to keep us all docile and compliant. The thought terrified me, but not as much as what I discovered next. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard soft knocking on my door. Through the camera feed, I saw Elizabeth standing there, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Sarah, the nurse who had supposedly moved out, but something was horribly wrong with her. Her eyes were solid black, no whites, no iris, just endless dark. Her movements were jerky, puppet-like, as if invisible strings were controlling her limbs. The elderly couple from 3A was there too, standing with that same wrong posture, those same black eyes. Elizabeth looked directly at my camera, somehow knowing I was watching, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged on something that had learned about human expressions from textbooks, but had never felt the emotions behind them. She spoke, and her voice came through my door as if the wood wasn't there at all. "Marcus from 4A, she said in that multiple voice tone. "You've been very observant. We appreciate observant humans. They make the best additions to our collection." My hands shook as I backed away from the door, grabbing my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The landline was dead too. The internet had cut out. I was completely isolated, trapped in my apartment with that thing and its converted puppets standing right outside. "We're not here to harm you, Marcus," Elizabeth continued, and I could hear amusement in those layered voices. "We're here to preserve you. Your neighbors haven't disappeared. They've been improved, enhanced, made part of something so much greater than their small, individual existences." Through the peephole camera, I watched as Elizabeth's form began to shift and ripple. The vintage dress tore as her body expanded, revealing something underneath that my mind struggled to process. It was like looking at a living hole in reality, a space where something existed that shouldn't be able to exist in our three-dimensional world. Tentacles, or what my brain interpreted as tentacles for lack of a better reference, writhed where her limbs should be. Her face split open vertically, revealing rows of what might have been eyes, or might have been something else entirely. "We've been here so much longer than you know," she said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This building, it's our garden, our cultivation center. We plant ourselves among you, learn your patterns, your behaviors, your dreams and fears. And when we understand you completely, we preserve you, add you to our collection, make you eternal." The converted neighbors began to speak in unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony. "We are preserved. We are eternal. We are collection." I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the gas canister I used for my camping stove and the matches from my emergency kit. "Stay back," I shouted, holding them up like the world's most pathetic weapons. "I'll burn this whole place down if you come in here." Elizabeth laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "Fire, Marcus? How delightfully primitive. But very well. We'll give you time to consider. You can't leave, you know. The building won't let you. None of the preserved can leave until they've been fully integrated. But we're patient. We've been patient for decades, slowly collecting, slowly growing our garden." They retreated then, Elizabeth's form somehow folding back into that too-tall woman in the vintage dress, the converted neighbors shuffling away with their puppet walks. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in my bathtub with a gas canister and matches, figuring the bathroom with its small window might give me the best chance of survival if I needed to start a fire. When morning came, I tried to leave the building, but Elizabeth had been telling the truth. The front door wouldn't open for me. The windows were suddenly reinforced with something invisible but impenetrable. The fire escapes had vanished as if they'd never existed. Other tenants walked past me in the hallways as if everything was normal, but I noticed things about them I'd missed before. The slight delay in their reactions, the way they all blinked in unison every 43 seconds, the fact that none of them ever actually entered or left the building anymore. I realized with growing horror that I might be the only truly human person left in the entire complex. For 3 days, I stayed barricaded in my apartment, surviving on whatever food I had, documenting everything on my phone even though I had no way to send it to anyone. Elizabeth would visit each night, sometimes alone, sometimes with her growing collection of converted neighbors. She would tell me stories about what she was, where her kind came from, though I'm not sure how much of it was true and how much was designed to break down my psychological resistance. According to her, they were collectors from a dimension where physical form was optional, where consciousness could be preserved like data, stored and accessed at will. They'd found Earth centuries ago, drawn by the complexity of human emotion and memory. They didn't see what they did as evil or invasive. To them, they were archaeologists, preserving human experiences before our inevitable self-destruction. "Your species is so fragile," she explained on the third night. "Wars, climate change, disease. You're racing toward extinction. We're saving you, saving your experiences, your memories, your essence. In our collection, you'll exist forever, experiencing every moment of your life simultaneously, forever present in your happiest memories, your most profound experiences." It sounded like hell to me, being trapped in an eternal loop of memory, but the converted neighbors seemed peaceful, almost blissful in their puppet-like existence. Maybe once the conversion was complete, you didn't care anymore. Maybe that was the most terrifying part. On the fourth night, something changed. Elizabeth didn't come to my door. Instead, I heard commotion in the hallway, shouting, and what sounded like fighting. Through my peephole camera, I saw something extraordinary. A group of people in what looked like military gear, but not quite standard issue. Their equipment had strange symbols, glowing panels, technology that looked both advanced and somehow ancient. They were fighting Elizabeth, or what Elizabeth had become when threatened. She was in her true form, that reality-bending mass of impossible geometry and writhing appendages, and she was fierce. 2 of the soldiers were down before I could even process what was happening. their bodies simply ceasing to exist where her tentacles touched them. But the others kept fighting, using weapons that seemed to tear holes in space itself, wounds that even Elizabeth couldn't immediately heal. One of the soldiers noticed my camera and gestured urgently for me to open my door. I hesitated for only a moment before yanking it open, and a woman in her 40s with scarred features and exhausted eyes pushed past me, slamming the door behind her. "Marcus Chen?" she asked, and when I nodded, she continued, "We've been monitoring this situation. You're the last unconverted resident. We need to get you out before the building completes its transformation." "Transformation?" I asked, but she was already pulling me toward the window, attaching some device that made the invisible barrier visible, a writhing mass of the same non-reality that Elizabeth was made of. "The entire building is alive," she explained, working on breaking through the barrier. "It's been alive for 43 years, feeding on residents, replacing them with preserved copies while the originals are absorbed into its structure. Elizabeth isn't a tenant. She's more like an antibody, a defense mechanism. We've been tracking these infected buildings across the country. This is the 15th one we've found." The barrier shattered like glass made of light, and she pushed me toward the window. "Fire escape will manifest in 30 seconds. When it does, you run. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run. We'll handle the rest." "The other residents," I started, but she cut me off. "They're gone, have been for years. What you've been seeing are echoes, memories given form. The building feeds on their experiences, replaying them endlessly. The real Sarah, the real Mr. and Mrs. Chen, they were absorbed long ago. Elizabeth was just the latest incarnation of the building's defense system, adapted to seem more human, more capable of luring in new residents." The fire escape materialized, and I climbed out into the cool night air that had never felt so sweet. As I descended, I heard Elizabeth's voice, no longer multilayered but singular and ancient. "You can't stop us all. We're in your foundations, your walls, your very infrastructure. We're preserving your entire civilization, one building at a time." The building began to shake and writhe, its edges blurring as it revealed its true nature. It wasn't made of brick and mortar, but of something organic and wrong, something that pulsed with stolen life. The soldiers continued their battle inside as I ran, following the female soldiers' instructions to not look back. But I did look back once, just as the building collapsed in on itself, folding into a space that shouldn't have been able to contain it, leaving nothing but an empty lot where a 5-story apartment complex had stood moments before. The soldier who had saved me found me 3 blocks away, sitting on a bench, trying to process what I'd witnessed. She sat down beside me, lighting a cigarette with hands that barely shook, a testament to how many times she'd done this before. "We'll relocate you," she said. "New identity, new city, new life. It's the only way to be sure they can't track you. You've been marked now, tagged by exposure to their preservation field. Other infected buildings will recognize you, try to draw you in." "How many are there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She took a long drag of her cigarette before answering. "We don't know. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They've been here since at least the 1940s, possibly longer. Apartment buildings, hotels, hospitals, anywhere people live in close proximity, anywhere they can create their preservation chambers without being noticed." She handed me a card with nothing but a phone number on it. "If you ever see the signs again, residents all moving in perfect synchronization, people who don't quite act human, spaces that feel wrong, you call this number. We'll come." That was 5 years ago. I live in a small town in Montana now, in a single-story house with no neighbors for miles. I avoid apartment buildings, hotels, anywhere people cluster together in close quarters. Sometimes I dream about Elizabeth, about the building, about the preserved residents living their endless loops of memory. Sometimes I wake up at exactly 11:47 p.m., the time Elizabeth used to leave her apartment, and I check all my locks, all my windows, making sure nothing is trying to preserve me. The official story was a gas leak explosion that destroyed the building. The media never questioned why there were no bodies found in the wreckage, why none of the supposed residents had family looking for them, why the lot where the building stood won't grow anything, not even weeds. The truth was too impossible for anyone to believe anyway. But I know the truth. I know that somewhere out there, in apartment buildings and hotels and dormitories, things that aren't human are pretending to be our neighbors, studying us, preparing to preserve us in their twisted form of salvation. I know that Elizabeth and things like her are still out there, wearing human faces, knocking on doors in the middle of the night, building their collections one resident at a time. Sometimes I wonder if I really escaped, or if this is just another layer of preservation, if I'm living in an endless loop of memory, believing I'm free while actually being stored in some impossible collection. The thought keeps me awake at night, checking my reflection to make sure my eyes haven't turned black, that my movements aren't becoming puppet-like, that I'm still human and not just the memory of one. But even if this is real, even if I did escape, I know it's not over. The soldier was right about being marked. I can feel them sometimes, the infected buildings, calling to me when I drive through cities. They recognize me as the one who got away, the incomplete preservation, the collection that was never finished. One day, they'll probably find me. One day, I'll probably end up preserved whether I want to be or not. Until then, I live each day knowing it could be my last as a free human being. I document everything, upload it to servers around the world, hoping that if I disappear, someone will find my story and know the truth. The woman in apartment 4B wasn't a woman at all. She was something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any of us could have imagined. And she's still out there, in 1,000 different buildings, wearing 1,000 different faces, knocking on doors in the middle of the night, building her collection one neighbor at a time. The perfect family portrait. My name is Jennifer, and I was 28 years old when I moved back to my childhood neighborhood to take care of my aging mother, a decision that would lead me to uncover a truth about the family across the street that still haunts me 5 years later. Sycamore Lane hadn't changed much in the decade I'd been gone. The same colonial houses with their manicured lawns, the same oak trees that had been there since before I was born, the same sense of suburban perfection that had made me desperate to escape to the city after high school. But now, with Mom's hip surgery and Dad gone 3 years prior, I found myself back in my childhood bedroom, staring out the same window I'd spent countless hours gazing through as a teenager, dreaming of bigger things. The Richardsons still lived across the street, though they were the only original neighbors left from my childhood. They were the type of family that made everyone else feel inadequate by comparison. David Richardson with his silver fox good looks and successful dental practice, Patricia with her perfect blonde barb and spotless house that looked like a magazine spread, and their 3 children who seemed to excel at everything they touched. When I was young, Mom would always compare me to the Richardson kids, holding them up as examples of what proper children should be like. But something had changed about them in the years I'd been gone. Something subtle but unmistakable once you started paying attention. It started with their routine, which I began to notice during my first weeks back home. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., the entire family would emerge from their house in a perfect line. David first, then Patricia, then the 3 kids in age order. They would walk to their respective cars with identical gaits, their arms swinging at the exact same angle, their heads held at precisely the same tilt. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the mind playing tricks from boredom and the stress of being back in a place I'd tried so hard to leave behind. But then I started documenting it with my phone, recording their morning ritual from my bedroom window. When I played the videos back in slow motion, the synchronization was undeniable and deeply unsettling. They moved like a choreographed dance troupe, or like those creepy synchronized swimming teams, except they were just walking to their cars. Every step matched, every gesture mirrored, even their blinks seemed to happen in unison. Mom thought I was being ridiculous when I mentioned it to her. "The Richardsons have always been very organized," she said from her recliner, dismissing my concerns with a wave of her hand that still showed the 4 bruising from her recent hospital stay. "You could learn something from their discipline, Jennifer. Maybe if you'd been more like the Richardson children, you wouldn't have needed to move back home." The comment stung, but I was used to it. Mom had always held the Richardsons up as the gold standard of family perfection, and my return home as a failed artist with a broken engagement behind me only reinforced her disappointment. But her criticism didn't change what I was seeing, and the more I watched the Richardsons, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. Their house was another source of unease. It was always perfect, impossibly so. The lawn was trimmed to exactly 2 3/4 inches. I measured it one night out of morbid curiosity. The windows were so clean they might as well have been holes in the walls. The paint never chipped, the roof never collected leaves, even their trash cans were spotless. But what really disturbed me was the family portrait in their living room window. It was massive, probably 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, positioned so anyone walking or driving by could see it. The portrait showed the 5 of them in formal wear, posed in front of a green screen background that had been replaced with an idyllic sunset. They were all smiling, but the smiles were identical, not in a family resemblance way, but literally identical, as if the same smile had been copied and pasted onto 5 different faces. The portrait had been there as long as I could remember, but the family in it never aged. David's hair never grayed, Patricia's face never developed lines. The children remained frozen at the same ages they'd been a decade ago. I mentioned this oddity to Mrs. Yamamoto, who lived next door to the Richardsons and was one of the few neighbors I remembered from childhood. She was tending her garden when I stopped to chat, and her expression darkened when I brought up the portrait. "I try not to look at that house too much," she said, lowering her voice even though we were alone in her yard. "There's something not right about that family. They never age. You noticed that? 10 years I've lived here, and those kids haven't grown an inch. The middle one, Rebecca, she's been 14 for the entire decade." "That's impossible," I said, though I'd noticed the same thing. Mrs. Yamamoto shrugged, returning to her roses with deliberate focus. "Lots of impossible things in this world, Jennifer. Best not to dig too deep into some of them." But I couldn't let it go. The journalist in me, even though I'd failed to make it as an investigative reporter in the city, couldn't resist a mystery this bizarre. I started researching the Richardsons, digging through public records, social media, anything I could find. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. According to official records, David Richardson had been 43 years old for the past 15 years. Patricia had been 39 for just as long. The children's school records were even stranger, showing them enrolled in the same grades year after year, with notes about them repeating due to family circumstances that were never elaborated upon. How had no one noticed this? How had the school system allowed it? I decided to approach Rebecca Richardson directly. Of the 3 kids, she seemed the most likely to break from the family's perfect synchronization. I'd caught her looking at their house from the street sometimes, standing at the edge of their property line with an expression that might have been longing or fear or both. One afternoon, when I saw her walking home from school alone, a rare occurrence since the Richardson children usually moved as a unit, I intercepted her on the sidewalk. "Rebecca, hi," I said, trying to sound casual and failing. "I'm Jennifer from across the street. I used to babysit you when you were younger, though you probably don't remember." She stopped walking and turned to face me with movements so smooth they seemed almost mechanical. Up close, I could see that her skin had a strange quality to it, too perfect, like it had been airbrushed in real life. Her eyes were bright blue, but the brightness seemed artificial, like colored contacts that were slightly too vivid to be natural. "I remember," she said, and her voice had an odd quality, like it was coming from a speaker inside her throat rather than being produced naturally. You moved away to become a writer. You failed. Now you're back to take care of your dying mother. The bluntness of her words shocked me, but not as much as the complete lack of emotion in her delivery. She might as well have been reading a grocery list. Mom's not dying, I said defensively. She just needed help after her surgery. Rebecca tilted her head exactly 45 degrees to the left, a movement so precise it looked inhuman. Everyone is dying, Jennifer. Some just take longer than others. My family doesn't die. We're preserved. Preserved, I echoed, feeling a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. Father says we're perfect now, Rebecca continued in that same emotionless tone. He made us perfect 13 years ago. We don't age, we don't get sick, we don't fight or disagree. We're the ideal family, frozen at the peak of our beauty and success. Before I could respond, she straightened her head and walked away, her gait returning to that unsettling synchronized rhythm even though she was alone. I stood on the sidewalk, my mind reeling from what she'd said. Made them perfect? Frozen at their peak? What did any of that mean? That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my window, watching the Richardson house, and at exactly 3:33 a.m., I saw something that made my blood run cold. All 5 members of the family were standing in their backyard, perfectly still, facing the same direction toward the moon. They stood there for exactly 1 hour, not moving, not even swaying in the breeze that rustled the trees around them. Then, at 4:33 a.m., they all turned in unison and walked back into the house. I had to know more. The next day, while the Richardsons were out at their various daily activities, all perfectly timed and scheduled, I did something I'm not proud of. I broke into their house. The back door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning that something was expecting me, but my curiosity overrode my caution. The inside of the house was even more perfect than the outside. Everything was symmetrical, every surface spotless, every item placed with mathematical precision. The temperature was exactly 72 degrees in every room. The air smelled like nothing, not clean, not dirty, just the complete absence of scent. It was like walking through a 3D rendering of a house, rather than an actual lived-in home. I made my way to David's study, figuring if there were answers to be found, they'd be in there. The room was lined with medical texts, which made sense given his dental practice, but there were also books on taxidermy, preservation techniques, and something called temporal crystallization that seemed to be more science fiction than science. On his desk was a journal, and what I read there changed everything I thought I knew about the Richardsons and the nature of reality itself. The journal entries started 13 years ago, right around the time Mrs. Yamamoto said the family stopped aging. David wrote about his fear of losing his perfect family, about watching other families in the neighborhood fall apart through divorce, rebellion, tragedy. He wrote about his discovery of a technique he called living preservation, something he'd learned from a patient who claimed to be over 200 years old but looked no older than 30. The technique involved a combination of chemical treatments, electromagnetic field manipulation, and something David referred to only as the sacrifice. The entries became increasingly technical and difficult to understand, filled with formulas and diagrams that hurt to look at, as if they were designed for eyes that could see in more dimensions than human eyes could process. But the final entries were clear enough. David had perfected his technique and applied it to his entire family. They were now preserved in life, frozen at what he considered their perfect moments. Patricia would forever be beautiful and devoted. The children would never rebel, never leave, never disappoint. They would be the perfect family for eternity. The cost, however, was everything that made them human. They no longer felt emotions, only performed them. They no longer had thoughts, only programmed responses. They were living mannequins, playing out the same perfect family routine day after day, year after year, forever. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear them come home. It wasn't until I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and firm like marble wrapped in skin, that I realized I was no longer alone. David Richardson stood behind me, his perfect smile stretched across his face, his two bright eyes boring into mine. "Jennifer," he said, his voice as emotionless as his daughter's had been, "I've been expecting you. Your mother told us you've been watching our family. She's concerned about your mental state." The other family members filed into the room, moving in that horrible synchronization, surrounding me. Patricia held what looked like an antique medical syringe filled with an iridescent fluid that seemed to move on its own. "Your mother asked us to help you," David continued. "She wants you to be perfect too, to stop disappointing her, to become the daughter she always wanted, like our Rebecca." I tried to run, but they moved faster than should have been possible, their preserved bodies apparently enhanced in ways beyond just stopping aging. They held me down with inhuman strength as David took the syringe from his wife. "Don't worry," he said, still smiling that terrible smile. "It won't hurt. Nothing will ever hurt again. You'll be perfect, Jennifer. Forever young, forever obedient, forever exactly what your mother wants you to be." The needle came closer to my neck, and I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. Loud enough that Mrs. Yamamoto heard me from next door. Loud enough that she called 911. Loud enough that the police arrived just as the needle touched my skin. The Richardsons released me immediately when they heard the sirens, returning to their perfect poses, their perfect smiles, acting like nothing had happened. When the police arrived, they found me hysterical in the study, while the Richardson family stood in their living room, looking concerned and confused, the perfect picture of innocent neighbors worried about a troubled young woman. "She broke into our house," David explained calmly to the officers. "We found her reading my private journals, having some kind of episode. We were trying to calm her down when she started screaming. The police believed them, of course. Why wouldn't they? The Richardsons were pillars of the community, the perfect family, while I was the failed artist who'd moved back home, clearly struggling with mental health issues. I was given a warning for breaking and entering, and David graciously declined to press charges, saying he understood I was under stress from caring for my mother. But I saw the look in his eyes as the police led me out. This wasn't over. That night, I packed everything I could fit in my car. I tried to convince Mom to come with me, but she wouldn't hear of it. "You're being ridiculous, Jennifer," she said. "The Richardsons are good people. David even offered to give me free dental work. They're more caring than my own daughter, who wants to abandon me again." I left anyway. I had to. I could feel them watching me from across the street, all 5 of them standing at their windows, perfectly still, waiting for me to sleep, waiting for another chance to make me perfect. I drove through the night, putting as much distance between myself and Sycamore Lane as possible. I left Mom there, and that guilt eats at me every day. I check on her through phone calls, though she rarely answers, and when she does, she sounds different. Flatter, more perfect in her pronunciation, more synchronized in her responses. 6 months after I left, I received a package at my new apartment 3 states away. Inside was a photograph, a new family portrait of the Richardsons. But this time, there were 7 people in the image. My mother stood on one side, her face bearing that same terrible smile, her eyes that same artificial brightness. And on the other side stood someone who looked exactly like me, or rather like a perfected version of me. My face but symmetrical, my body but idealized, my smile but empty of everything that made me human. The back of the photo had a message in David's handwriting. "Your mother is happy now. She has the perfect daughter she always wanted. You're welcome to come home and join us. We'll be waiting. We have all the time in the world. I burned the photo, but I know it doesn't matter. They're still there on Sycamore Lane, the perfect family that never ages, never changes, never dies. My mother is with them now, preserved at what David probably considered her peak, even if that peak was 73 years old with an artificial hip. And somewhere in that house is a thing that looks like me, acts like me, but is nothing more than a living doll, playing out the role of the perfect daughter my mother always wanted. I've contacted authorities, tried to get someone to investigate, but who would believe me? The Richardsons are still the perfect family, still the pride of Sycamore Lane. They still emerge at 7:15 a.m. in perfect synchronization. They still stand in their backyard at 3:33 a.m., facing the moon. They still have that portrait in their window, now with 7 people instead of 5, all smiling that same empty smile. Sometimes I wonder if David's technique could spread, if other families in other neighborhoods are being offered the chance to become perfect, to never age, never argue, never disappoint. The thought keeps me up at night, wondering how many perfect families are out there, frozen in their ideal moments, playing out the same routines for eternity. I live alone now, far from any neighborhoods, far from families and their portraits and their synchronized movements. I age normally, disappointingly, humanly. Every wrinkle, every gray hair, every ache and pain is a reminder that I'm still real, still flawed, still free. But freedom comes with a price. Every Mother's Day, I receive a card from my sister, the perfect version of me. The handwriting is mine but too precise, the message loving but hollow. She tells me about taking care of our mother, about family dinners where everyone sits in perfect posture and speaks in perfect turn, about holidays that are photographed but never truly felt. The worst part is knowing that somewhere, my real mother might still be conscious inside that preserved shell, aware but unable to break free from the perfection David Richardson imposed upon her. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to justify abandoning her. Maybe she really is happy now, freed from disappointment, frozen in a moment of eternal satisfaction with the family she always wanted, even if that family is nothing more than beautiful corpses pretending to be alive. I've researched David's references to temporal crystallization and living preservation, following rabbit holes through obscure medical journals and ancient texts. What I found suggests this isn't new, that throughout history there have been those who discovered how to stop time in living tissue, to preserve the appearance of life while killing everything that makes life worth living. The ancient Egyptians might have known it, certain medieval alchemists certainly did, and now a dentist in suburban America has perfected it. The technique is spreading. I found news stories, buried in local papers, about families that seem too perfect, that never age, that move in uncanny synchronization, always in suburban neighborhoods, always in places where conformity is valued over individuality, where the appearance of perfection matters more than authentic existence. The Richardson method is becoming a movement, though no one would ever call it that. It's more like a virus, spreading from family to family, offering eternal youth and harmony at the cost of everything that makes us human. I've written about it, tried to warn people, but my articles are dismissed as fiction, as urban legend, as the ramblings of someone who clearly had a mental breakdown after failing to make it as a serious journalist. The Richardsons have made sure of that, their influence extending far beyond Sycamore Lane. David's dental practice has branches in 12 states now, each one a potential conversion center for families seeking perfection. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering if they were right, if it would be better to be preserved, to never feel disappointment or fear or loneliness again, to be part of a perfect family, even if that perfection is nothing more than an elaborate pantomime. The thought terrifies me because I know it's exactly what they want me to think. They're patient, the preserved. They have all the time in the world to wait for me to come home. But I won't. I'll grow old alone if I have to. I'll die human and flawed and real. Because I've seen what perfection looks like, and it's nothing more than death wearing a smile, walking around in bodies that used to house souls, playing out scripts in houses that used to be homes. The Richardsons are still there on Sycamore Lane, still perfect, still waiting. My mother is with them, or the thing that used to be my mother. And somewhere in that house, my perfect double lives the life I was supposed to live, being the daughter I was supposed to be, forever and ever, world without end. But I'm free, imperfect, aging, disappointing, but free. And that's the only victory I can claim against the perfect family portrait that tried to claim me. The sound in the walls. My name is Robert, and I need to tell you about the 6 months I lived next to the Whispering Man, though that's not what he called himself, and not what the landlord called him either. To everyone else, he was Mr. Garrett, a quiet tenant in 6B who paid his rent on time and never caused trouble. But I knew better. I knew about the sounds in the walls, the voices that weren't quite voices, and the terrible truth about what he was building in that apartment. I was 31 when I moved into the Grandview Heights apartment complex in Portland, running from a failed marriage and a career that had peaked 5 years too early. The divorce had cleaned me out financially, and Grandview Heights was what I could afford, a step above squalor but several steps below respectable. The building was old, built in the 1920s, with thin walls that let you hear every footstep, every argument, every moment of your neighbors' lives whether you wanted to or not. Apartment 6A wasn't much, just a studio with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette that barely deserved the name, but it had good light and was walking distance from the craft brewery where I'd found work as an assistant manager. It was supposed to be temporary, just a place to rebuild while I figured out what came next. I never imagined it would become the center of a nightmare that still wakes me up screaming 5 years later. Mr. Garrett moved in 3 weeks after I did. I was coming home from a late shift when I saw him in the hallway, struggling with a large wooden crate that seemed too heavy for his thin frame. He was probably in his 60s, with wild grey hair that looked like he'd been electrocuted, thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree, and clothes that belonged to another era, all tweed and elbow patches like a professor from the 1950s. "Need a hand?" I offered, because my mother raised me to be helpful, even when every instinct told me to keep walking. He looked at me with those magnified eyes, studying me like I was a specimen under a microscope. "That would be acceptable," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow perfectly clear, as if it was coming from inside my own head rather than from his mouth. Together, we wrestled the crate into his apartment. The space was identical to mine in layout, but felt completely different. Where mine was sparse and temporary looking, his was packed with equipment I couldn't identify, machines that hummed at frequencies that made my teeth ache, walls covered in equations and diagrams that hurt to look at directly. The air itself felt thick, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. "You're sensitive," he said, noticing my discomfort. "That's rare. Most people can't feel the resonance." "Resonance?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Everything vibrates," he explained, adjusting one of his machines with delicate precision. "Every atom, every molecule, every thought. I'm studying the frequencies, mapping the harmonics of existence itself. Would you like to hear?" Before I could answer, he flipped a switch on one of his devices. The room filled with a sound that wasn't quite sound, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was beautiful and terrible, like hearing the universe breathing, like understanding a fundamental truth that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my own apartment with no memory of how I'd gotten there. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the sounds started. At first, they were subtle, just barely audible through the wall we shared. It sounded like whispering, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, but not quite synchronized, creating a susurrus that seemed to form words just beyond understanding. I tried to ignore it, buying a white noise machine, wearing earplugs, even sleeping with headphones on. Nothing helped. The whispering seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my bones, in my brain, in spaces between my thoughts. I complained to the landlord, Mrs. Chen, but when she went to investigate, the sounds stopped. Mr. Garrett answered his door, polite and confused, insisting he lived alone and barely made any noise at all. Mrs. Chen looked at me like I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The lack of sleep was getting to me, making me irritable at work, prone to mistakes and outbursts that had my manager threatening to let me go. But then I started to understand the whispers. It happened gradually, like tuning into a distant radio station. Words began to emerge from the susurrus, fragments of sentences that almost made sense. They spoke of dimensions folded into our own, of spaces between spaces where things that weren't quite alive and weren't quite dead existed in states of perpetual becoming. They spoke of the resonance, the fundamental frequency that held reality together, and what would happen if someone learned to modulate it. I should have moved out then, should have broken my lease, found somewhere else, anywhere else. But I was fascinated despite my terror, drawn to the mystery like a moth to flame. I started keeping a journal, documenting the whispers, trying to decode their meaning. I found myself pressing my ear against the wall at night, straining to hear more clearly, to understand what Mr. Garrett was doing in there. 3 months into my stay, the walls began to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight transparency that I attributed to exhaustion and eye strain. But over time, it became undeniable. The wall between our apartments was becoming thin, not physically, but in some other way I couldn't quite define. Sometimes I could see through it, glimpsing Mr. Garrett's apartment like looking through frosted glass. But what I saw didn't match what I remembered from that first visit. The space seemed larger, extending in directions that didn't align with the building's architecture. I saw corridors that couldn't exist, rooms that overlapped with other rooms, geometries that made my eyes water and my head pound. And moving through these impossible spaces were figures that might have been human once but weren't anymore, elongated and distorted like shadows cast by multiple light sources. Mr. Garrett noticed me watching. One night, as I peered through the increasingly transparent wall, he turned and looked directly at me, those magnified eyes boring into mine across the impossible space between us. "You can see them," he said, and his voice came through the wall as clearly as if he was standing next to me. "The previous tenants. They volunteered for my early experiments. They exist in the harmonics now, in the spaces between frequencies. They're quite happy, I assure you. Would you like to join them?" I stumbled back from the wall, my heart racing. "You're insane," I gasped. "Sanity is a frequency," he replied calmly. "I've simply learned to tune to different channels. The whispers you hear, they're trying to teach you, to prepare you. Your sensitivity makes you a perfect candidate for translation. Translation from this crude material existence to something far more elegant. The human form is so limiting, don't you think? Trapped in 3 dimensions, bound by linear time, subject to decay and death. But in the resonance, in the spaces between, you could exist as pure vibration, experiencing all possibilities simultaneously." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers had grown louder, and I realized with horror that I was beginning to understand them completely. They were the voices of his previous experiments, the tenants who had lived in 6A before me, now existing as frequency patterns in the walls, in the air, in the spaces between atoms. "Join us," they whispered in perfect harmony. "It doesn't hurt. Nothing hurts here. We are beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond the crude limitations of flesh." That night, I tried to leave. I packed what I could carry and headed for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, the lock disengaged, but the door remained sealed as if the space beyond it no longer existed. The windows were the same, opening onto nothing but static, like television snow made three-dimensional. Mr. Garrett's voice came through the wall, patient and almost kind. "The building is in transition now. I've been preparing it for months, adjusting its resonance, teaching it to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Soon, the entire structure will translate, and everyone inside will be freed from their material prisons." I realized then that every tenant in the building was in danger. I tried calling 911, but my phone couldn't find a signal. We were already partially translated, existing in a frequency that normal communication couldn't reach. I pounded on the walls, screaming for my other neighbors to get out, but my fists passed through the increasingly insubstantial surfaces, and my voice came out as whispers that joined the chorus in the walls. For 3 days, I existed in that liminal state, watching as my apartment became less and less solid, as the boundaries between spaces dissolved. I saw my neighbors through the transparent walls, some panicking like me, others sitting calmly as if they'd already accepted their fate. Mrs. Rodriguez from 5A was praying, her rosary beads falling through her translucent fingers. The college kids from 7C were holding each other, their forms already beginning to merge at the edges. Mr. Garrett moved through the building like a conductor preparing his orchestra, adjusting frequencies, fine-tuning resonances, preparing us all for the final translation. He would stop at my wall sometimes, those huge eyes studying me with what might have been pity. "You're resisting," he observed. "That's causing you unnecessary distress. Let go, Robert. Embrace the transformation. In a few hours, you'll thank me for freeing you from the prison of flesh." But I couldn't let go. Something in me, some stubborn spark of humanity, refused to surrender. I focused on physical sensations: hunger, thirst, pain from where I'd cut myself trying to break through the window. These crude bodily experiences seemed to anchor me, to keep me from dissolving entirely into the resonance. On the 4th day, just as I felt my resistance failing, just as the whispers were beginning to sound like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard, something changed. The building shuddered, the carefully maintained frequencies suddenly discordant. Through my translucent window, I saw fire trucks, police cars, and vehicles I didn't recognize, black SUVs with government plates and equipment that looked more like weapons than rescue tools. Someone had noticed our disappearance. Later, I learned it was Mrs. Chen, the landlord, who'd come for the monthly rent collection and found the building existing in a state she described as there but not there, visible but intangible, like a projection or a mirage. What happened next was a battle fought on frequencies I could barely perceive. The government vehicles deployed devices that screamed in harmonics that made Mr. Garrett's equipment seem primitive. They were fighting to pull us back, to re-anchor the building in normal reality, while Mr. Garrett fought to complete the translation. I felt myself being torn between states, existing simultaneously as flesh and frequency, solid and sound. The whispers in the walls reached a crescendo, and I heard them clearly for the first time, not as words but as pure emotion: terror, regret, desperate longing to return to the crude physical forms they'd so willingly abandoned. The previous tenants hadn't volunteered. They'd been seduced, convinced, manipulated into giving up their humanity for a promise of transcendence that was nothing but imprisonment in the spaces between reality. With the last of my strength, the last of my solidity, I crawled to Mr. Garrett's apartment. The wall was completely gone now. Our spaces merged into something that existed in too many dimensions at once. He was at his primary device, frantically adjusting controls, trying to complete the translation before the outside forces could stop him. "You don't understand," he said without looking at me, his form flickering between states. "This is evolution, the next step in human consciousness. We can exist as pure thought, pure possibility." "They're screaming," I managed to say. my voice barely more than a whisper itself. The ones you translated. They're not happy. They're trapped. He turned to me then, and I saw something in those magnified eyes I hadn't expected. Doubt. For just a moment, his certainty wavered, and in that moment of hesitation, the outside forces broke through. The building snapped back into normal reality with a violence that threw me across the room. Suddenly, everything was solid again, painfully, blessedly solid. My body ached from impact with a very real floor. My lungs burned as they remembered how to breathe normal air. My ears rang with the absence of the whispers that had been my constant companions for days. Mr. Garrett was on the ground, his equipment sparking and smoking around him. The government agents swarmed in, containing him with restraints that glowed with their own frequencies, designed to keep him anchored in this reality. As they dragged him away, he looked at me one last time. "You'll hear them forever now," he said, and there was something like sympathy in his voice. "The ones who were translated. They exist in the spaces between thoughts, between heartbeats. You've been sensitized to their frequency. You'll never be fully alone again." He was right. Even now, 5 years later, in the silence of night, I hear them. The whispers of the translated, the ones who gave up their humanity for a promise of transcendence and found only imprisonment in the resonance. They're not in the walls anymore. They're in the spaces between everything, trapped in frequencies that only the sensitized can perceive. The building was condemned after the incident, though the official story was structural damage from an earthquake that no seismograph recorded. The other tenants were relocated, given counseling, convinced that they'd experienced a gas leak hallucination. But I know the truth. We all lived through those days of dissolution, of existing between states, of nearly losing ourselves to the resonance. I've researched Mr. Garrett since then, though information is hard to come by. What I've found suggests he wasn't the first to discover how to manipulate reality's frequencies, and he won't be the last. Throughout history, there have been those who've learned to hear the underlying harmonics of existence, to recognize that what we call solid reality is just one frequency among infinite possibilities. Some of them, like Mr. Garrett, try to translate themselves and others into these alternate frequencies, believing they're offering transcendence. They don't understand or don't care that consciousness without form, existence without boundaries, is just another kind of prison. The translated don't die, but they don't truly live either. They exist in perpetual states of becoming, never fully anywhere, always partially everywhere. I live in a house now, far from any apartments, far from shared walls where whispers might seep through. But it doesn't matter. Mr. Garrett was right about that too. Once you've been sensitized to the frequencies, once you've heard the resonance, you can never fully unhear it. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, I hear them still. The translated, the lost, the ones who gave up their crude flesh for something they thought would be better. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself listening too closely to their whispers, beginning to understand their invitation to join them in the spaces between. The temptation is always there, to let go of this heavy flesh, to dissolve into pure frequency, to exist beyond the limitations of physical form. But then I remember the terror in their voices, the regret that resonates through their endless existence, and I anchor myself again in this crude, painful, beautiful physical reality. I eat, I drink, I feel pain and pleasure. I age and know that someday I'll die. And that's better, so much better, than existing forever as a whisper in the walls, a frequency in the void, a consciousness without form trapped in the spaces between everything and nothing. The sound in the walls never really goes away. Once you've heard it, once you've understood it, it becomes part of you. But you can choose not to listen, to focus instead on the solid, real sounds of life. Heartbeats, breathing, footsteps on solid ground. These are the sounds that keep us human, that keep us here, that keep us from dissolving into the beautiful, terrible resonance that underlies everything. Mr. Garrett is contained somewhere, in a facility designed to hold those who've learned to manipulate reality's frequencies. But there are others out there, I'm sure of it. Others who've heard the resonance, who've discovered the spaces between, who believe they can offer transcendence through translation. If you ever hear whispers in your walls that seem to bypass your ears, if your reality starts to feel thin, if someone offers to free you from the prison of flesh, remember this. The prison of flesh is still better than the freedom of formlessness. We are meant to be solid, to be bounded, to exist in one state at a time. The spaces between are not for us, no matter how beautiful the whispers make them sound. Stay solid. Stay real. Stay human. No matter what the voices in the walls promise, no matter how limiting this physical existence might seem, it's better than the alternative. Trust me. I've stood at the boundary between states. I've felt myself dissolving into frequency, and I chose to stay solid. It's a choice I make every day, every time I hear the whispers, every time the translated call out from their prison in the spaces between. And it's a choice I'll keep making until my crude flesh finally fails and I face whatever comes after in the way humans are meant to. Wholly, completely, and irrevocably ended rather than partially, eternally, and meaninglessly continued. The sound in the walls never stops. But you can choose not to follow it. You can choose to remain beautifully, painfully, temporarily human. And that choice, that stubborn insistence on staying solid in a universe of frequencies, might be the most human thing of all.